My name is Christina Lekati. I am a social engineering specialist and an open source intelligence analyst. I use those two specializations in my work for Cyber Risk GmbH, a Swiss company that is offering consulting and specialized training against cyber threats. And I focus on the human element of cybersecurity. Through Cyber Risk, I conduct open source intelligence vulnerability assessments, high-value target vulnerability assessments, and of course, social engineering training and consulting. Now, at the same time, I used to be a very happy and proud member of the OSINT Interviewees project. And at the same time, pretty active in this field, pretty excited and engaged in this field. I am also a speaker at various cybersecurity conferences, and I'm one of the co-instructors of the Fundamentals of Cyber Investigations and Human Intelligence class that we are delivering with Samuel Lollacart, or OSINT Geek. So in the field of social engineering, step number one in every engagement seems to be researching your target, the reconnaissance phase. How do you plan and prepare an attack? You have to base it on solid information on your target. And we access this information through open source intelligence. Specifically, we're going to go, if we have an engagement that focuses on the human layer of their security, and then on the physical layer of their security, we are going to go and look into the LinkedIn profiles of the employees. We're going to look into employer review websites to identify not only who works and on what position through LinkedIn, but also what the dynamics within the departments are. Because surprisingly, people share a lot about what happens internally on employee reviewer websites. We take this information and we use it in social engineering engagements. Of course, the research is much deeper. We look into specific events, dates that might be important for that company, partnerships. We look to see, we look for specific names within projects. These are usually found in case studies of other companies that market collaborations with our target. And we use all of that information. We bind it into a nice we create a nice map of how that company works, what the key people are, and what the dynamics between them are, and then we exploit this information in spear phishing attacks, in phishing attacks. We use a lot of name dropping based on the open source intelligence, and so on and so forth. And also on the physical layer, we look into Google Maps, pictures of those buildings to see, do they only have one main entrance that is guarded? Are there guards there, or are there also back entrances that seem to be more hidden and there is no security there, which we have come across many times? Are there articles and interviews out there that disclose the physical security measures of that company? What are they? Do we see videos with too many details of what kinds of doors they use, if they use RFID cards, and so on and so forth? These are all based on open source intelligence, and we also put them in our vulnerability reports because nobody needs to advertise what types of doors and security measures they have online. Similarly, in high-value target vulnerability assessments, we look to see what their level of predictability is. Do we find personal information that shouldn't be there, like home addresses, phone numbers? In Europe is not the US. In Europe, you are not supposed to have your physical address on the internet. It is personal information, it's highly protected, it's considered private, shouldn't be out there, as well as your phone number and other details. If it is out there, we need to see how it got there and whether we can take it down, and we always have the right to take that information down. How did I learn the OSINT skills that I have today? It was a long journey. So at the time that I started, there was not too much information out there just yet. OSINT it was starting to become a thing. The reality is that I started pretty young through my dad. My dad was a cybersecurity expert. He got me into the world of InfoSec, into the world of cybersecurity, started showing me the technical capabilities of computers, which got me pretty excited, and then started showing me how social engineering works and how somebody could potentially exploit human vulnerabilities to initiate a cyber attack. As the history showed, this got me very, very excited because I started asking more and more. I wanted to learn more and more about this topic. And eventually, I started working alongside him as well as an assistant or on minor projects, and then working my way up from that point, essentially. One good thing that he did for every parent out there, he let us, his kids, have an open bar policy when it came to books and educational resources, which I abused. I researched a lot. I started reading books on social engineering and open source intelligence, whatever I could find. I started following relevant people, uh, looking at their tips, experimenting with them. And after that point, you kind of get a feeling of how things work and start experimenting with them. So a very big chunk of my initial learning was based on self-learning, on experimentation and imagination, but it worked. And then from that point on, of course, I kept reading and learning with whatever chance I could find. When whatever was coming up, I was interested, I would experiment. I would see if it makes sense in my line of work or if I can twist it so that it can make sense in my line of work. And then with every project, I was trying to push my limit further and further and further. So I guess the way I learned came through this very useful trait of self-learning, and then through baptized with fire, because I had to learn on the job. Later on, I took some classes, I took courses, I tried to get more formal training, but in the end, none of them really beat self-learning. My experience started with my dad. Eventually, he told me, look, if you're interested in this field, go ahead and pave your own path. You have to make your way now. I studied psychology. I started applying what I learned from psychology into social engineering because I figured this is where my talent lied. I could understand why these attacks happened. I had a natural inclination to get to know more about social engineering and how to protect others from being tricked and scammed on the internet. And I continued on that path. I still continue until today. But we are here to talk about OSINT. So how did my path cross the OSINT path? Everybody that has worked in cybersecurity and especially in social engineering knows that every social engineering attack depends heavily on good intelligence. And we get good intelligence from open sources. So for open source intelligence, we have to research our targets before an attack. We have to find vulnerabilities on a human or the physical layers of a company's infrastructure, and then craft a pretext to exploit them. So through that part of my work, OSINT, the research phase, the reconnaissance phase, I realized that I have a huge investigative gene in me. I loved this work, absolutely loved it. And I started including it more and more in my reports. So at the end of a social engineering engagement, I would say, this is the attack, this is how we made it work, but these are also the information we based this attack on. And this is how we exploited this information that you made available on the internet. So clients started becoming interested in that part. What makes us vulnerable out there? What is the information that keeps us exposed? And eventually, by talking with them, by collaborating with our clients, we started offering this as a separate service, vulnerability assessments based on open source intelligence on the human and physical layers of organizations. So this became now a service. It became a service. We were working on that service. As we were working on that service, I got deeper and deeper into open source intelligence. And by now, on top of my social engineering prevention work, I also conduct open source intelligence vulnerability assessments on organizations and on high value targets. So there was a time in one of the projects where I had to encounter both sides of the coin when it came to OSINT, its good use and its bad use. Of course, it is a tool. You can use it for good purposes or bad purposes. And through this project, we saw both sides. There was an agent that called me once, and he told me that he has a group of 3 clients that are all being harassed through one specific group. They were being cyber harassed. Now, what was happening was that, well, their ideologies differed. This group decided to proclaim war on this other group of 3 people. And so they started sending them emails, approaching them through all social media, giving them physical threats or other types of threats, defamation, rape, beatings, even death of a spouse at some point was getting pretty severe on the side of threats. But then it started getting worse because they started calling their private phone numbers, which is when this group of 3 people started panicking and asked for help. Now, that client approached saying that, hey, I know this is not exactly what you do right now, but I know that you have a background in psychology, and we would really need to address this problem right now on multiple levels, both on the way these people feel, but also on acting on this issue and doing something about it. So basically, I sat down with them and I listened. I listened to the problem. I realized that the group that was targeting them was portraying a very godlike personality. They were trying to promote that they have inside information, that they know all these things about their plans, where these people are, where they move, their phone numbers. They started threatening with approaches at home and creating damage in their home properties, their private properties. So it was getting quite scary. Now, from private research, I realized that a lot of the information that this group was using was open source information. It was data that was out there either because these individuals disclosed it through social media or through other sources. Now, when we started tackling this problem, first I had to sit down with these 3 people, talk about what was happening and demystifying this group and how they were acting. So it was very therapeutic for them to know that no, these people are not gods. They don't have all the powers of the world over you just because they know a few things. This is how they get access to this information. This is what open source intelligence means, and that's how they abuse it. But guess what? You also have a certain level of control. You can control the information that is out there about you by step number 2, creating a report, identify the information that put them at risk, and either eliminate or manage it. So that was then the second step. I ran a research. I identified the points that this group was abusing and also additional ones that would potentially be abused in the future. And either we took it down or we anticipated next steps from those individuals, and we informed their security strategy in a way that would block any potential attacks or further harassment, especially on the physical sphere. That was very successful, thankfully. We then supplemented this with training on social engineering and hardening their private accounts, and also educating them on what not to share online, which seemed to help as well, because that group did try a few times to push out phishing attacks and do social media account takeovers that thankfully failed. But mostly it taught average people what open source intelligence means. Average people, I mean people that are not in the industry. The average person out there does not know how open source intelligence can be used against them. So it taught them what can be done for a bad reason, but also how you can battle it by being a bit more proactive. I think Micah Hoffman, who is also my interviewer today, he said at some point that we take privacy for granted, but in today's world, it's not, it is our right, but we have to fight for that right at the same time. We have to make sure that we maintain it manually. And this is also part of why I am sharing this story, I feel, because we have to talk with our people and our families about what our digital footprint means to us and how it can be used against us, but also how we have the power of what happens. Now, if there is someone that is entering the OSINT community or that is new here that wants to do what I do, or that just wants to learn open source intelligence and apply it in their work, I would advise relying on yourself and, again, this very useful trait of self-learning. Life can be complicated and there is a lot of figuring out. We are, I feel, in a constant process and in an industry of problem solving, and learning OSINT is not different. Thankfully, there are many resources out there. Use them, but in the end of the day, it will come down to how you experiment with them, how you apply them, how you bring them into your own work. Now, again, to get started, take, for example, Michael Bazel's book, Open Source Intelligence Techniques. I feel that this is the holy grail of a pretty comprehensive introduction to how open source intelligence works. However, it can be a little bit overwhelming because it covers many, many areas in a lot of detail. At the same time, I would advise you to attend free conferences on OSINT, to attend online communities on Twitter, Mastodon, or on Discord, and see what interests you as well. OSINT is a pretty vast and overwhelming discipline. It can go technical. You can focus on the human element, like I do. It still requires lateral thinking, critical thinking, and analytical thinking, which is a different area. See what interests you, compartmentalize, and take it one step at a time. And I feel that this is the most useful point that I want you to take out of here. Yes, start consuming online resources. There are many that are free or many that are relatively cheap. But in the end of the day, take it one step at a time. Learn a little something each time, and don't worry, because eventually it will all add up and make perfect sense.